The Battle of Island No. 10 was an engagement at the New Madrid or Kentucky Bend on the Mississippi River during the American Civil War, lasting from February 28 to April 8, 1862. The position, an island at the base of a tight double turn in the course of the river, was held by the Confederates from the early days of the war. It was an excellent site to impede Union efforts to invade the South along the river, as vessels would have to approach the island boson and then slow down to make the turns. For the defenders, it also had an innate weakness in that it depended on a single road for supplies and reinforcements, so that if an enemy force could cut that road, the garrison would be trapped. Union forces began the siege shortly after the Confederate Army abandoned their position at Columbus, Kentucky, in early March 1862. The first probes were made by the Union Army of the Mississippi under Brigadier General John Pope, which came overland through Missouri and occupied the town of Point Pleasant, Missouri, almost directly west of the island and south of New Madrid. From there, the Union Army moved north and soon brought siege guns to bear on New Madrid. The Confederate commander, Brig. Gen. John P. McCown, decided to evacuate the town after enduring only one day of bombardment, removing most of his soldiers to Island No. 10 but abandoning much of his equipment, including his heavy artillery. 2 days after the fall of New Madrid, Union gunboats and mortar rafts came down to attack Island No. 10 from the river. For the next 3 weeks, the defenders on the island and in nearby supporting batteries were subjected to bombardment by the vessels, mostly carried out by the mortars. While this was going on, the army at New Madrid was digging a canal across the neck of land to the east of the town. Several transports were sent to the Army of the Mississippi by way of the canal when it was finished, providing the army with the means of crossing the river and attacking the Confederate troops on the Tennessee side. Pope persuaded Flag Officer Andrew Hullfoot to send a gunboat past the batteries to aid him in the river crossing by warding off any Southern gunboats, and by suppressing rebel artillery fire at the point of attack. This was accomplished by US Carondelet, under Commander Henry Walker, on the night of April 4, 1862. This was followed by US Pittsburgh, under Lieutenant Egbert Thompson 2 nights later. With the support of these 2 gunboats, Pope was able to send his army across the river and trap the Confederates who were trying to flee. Outnumbered at least 3 to 1, they felt their cause was hopeless, and decided to surrender. At about the same time, the garrison who had remained at the island decided that resistance was futile for them as well, so they surrendered to Flag Officer Foote and the Union flotilla. The Union victory marked the first time the Confederate Army lost a position on the Mississippi River in battle. The river was then open to the Union Navy as far as Fort Pillow, a short distance above Memphis. Only 3 weeks later, New Orleans fell to the Union fleet led by David G. Farragut, and the Confederacy was in danger of being cut in two along the line of the river. Background. Geography. Island No. 10 owed its name to the fact that it was at one time the 10th island in the Mississippi River south of its junction with the Ohio. An evanescent product of the river, it was an enlarged sandbar, roughly 1 mile long and 450 yards wide at its maximum width, and standing about 10 feet above low water. More important than the island itself was the course of the river in its neighborhood. Island No. 10 was at the southern extremity of a clockwise turn of the river through 180 degrees, which was followed immediately by a counterclockwise turn that left the river moving almost parallel to its original course, but displaced to the west by about 8 miles. The turns are quite tight. The distance from the southern limit of the first turn to the northern limit of the second is only 9 miles by air, or 12 miles measured along the river channel. The double bend, which still exists in almost the same location, is known as the New Madrid Bend. However, the area across the Miss River from New Madrid, Missouri on the Kentucky and Tennessee shore was known during the Civil War simply as Madrid Bend. The mainland behind the island on the south side was connected to the town of Tiptonville, Tennessee, by a good road on the natural levee of the river. This was the only approach to the island on dry land through Tennessee, as the region is otherwise a mixture of lakes, sloughs, and swamps, with the nearest high ground nearly 10 miles to the east. Reelfoot Lake, the largest of these, was 40 miles long and in places 10 miles wide. In low water, the northern end of Reelfoot Lake was near Tiptonville, but in high water such as was present in the spring of 1862, it extended north to beyond the bend. The water was nowhere very deep, so that individual soldiers could cross it by wading or using makeshift rafts. But an army trying to do so would not be able to move its heavy equipment, and also would lose cohesion. For these reasons, Island No. 10 was considered to be invulnerable to land attack from the Tennessee side. It also meant, however, that the only route for either reinforcement or escape was the Tiptonville Road. The land on the Missouri side was higher, although not high enough to give guns mounted there the advantage of plunging fire. The river banks, about 30 feet above low water, were roughly only one-third as high as the bluffs that had aided the Confederate defense against gunboats at the Battle of Fort Donelson. At high water, although shore-based guns would not be drowned as they had been at the Battle of Fort Henry, they would nevertheless be no higher than the guns of vessels on the river. The town of New Madrid, which gives the bend its name, is at the northern apex of the second turn. It is most noted as eponyme of the most violent earthquakes to take place in the 48 contiguous United States in historical times. Opposing forces. Confederate command during the first year of the war. The Confederate forces in the West went through a series of command changes that are often confusing, and left responsibility for particular actions hard to pin down. Although New Madrid was in Missouri, it was in a pro-Southern part of the state, and therefore fell within the purview of Confederate Department No. 2. In command of the department was Maj. Gen. Leonidas Polk. The region of the Bend was brought to official notice by one of Polk's subordinates, Brig. Gen. Gideon J. Pillow. Neither Pillow nor Polk was actively involved in developing the defenses at the Bend, but the latter assigned an Army engineer, Captain Asher B. Gray, to the task. Gray worked hard, but he was not given the resources to complete the task. On September 15, General Albert Sidney Johnston superseded Polk in command of Department No. 2, with Polk remaining in a subordinate position. Like his predecessor, Johnston took no active interest in Island No. 10. In early February, just in time for the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson, General P. G. T. Beauregard was sent to the west to command the Army of the Mississippi, and became in effect Johnston's second-in-command. He recognized the importance of Island No. 10, and issued the orders to abandon Columbus and move its garrison there. His health failed him at this time, so he could not take personal charge. When he recovered, he and General Johnston were preoccupied with preparations for the forthcoming Battle of Shiloh. Transferred from Columbus to Island No. 10 was Major General John P. McCown, who thereby became local commander. He remained in charge until after New Madrid was taken by the Union Army of the Mississippi. On March 31, 1862, he was replaced by Brig. Gen. William W. Mackle. Through all of these command changes, the vessels of the Confederate States Navy along the entire length of the Mississippi were led by Flag Officer George N. Hollins. Because the river lay in two military departments, Hollins had to work with both the man in charge at the New Madrid Bend and the man in charge of the defenses of New Orleans. Union command at this time. Command of the Union forces was also in flux, but it had little bearing on the issue. From the time the campaign against New Madrid began, in late February 1862, the Army of the Mississippi was led by Maj. Gen. John Pope. The Army was a part of, first, the Department of the Missouri, and after March 11, the Department of the Mississippi, both under Maj. Gen. Henry W. Halleck. The name change represented organizational changes in the Army that did not affect the campaign. The warships employed in the campaign were part of the Western Gunboat Flotilla, led by Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote. Foote was a captain in the U.S. Navy, but the flotilla was organized as part of the U.S. Army, so he reported to, and was subordinate to, Halleck. Early defense preparations. The widespread publicity given to Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan made the Confederate government aware of the threat that would be posed to the Mississippi Valley by a waterborne invasion along the course of the river. In response, they set up a series of defensive positions along the river. Among them were Fort Pillow, 40 miles north of Memphis, and extensive works at Columbus, Kentucky, both of which positions were important in relation to Island No. 10. Construction of the batteries on and near the island began in mid-August 1861, directed by Captain Asher B. Gray. He began by laying out a battery on the Tennessee shore about 1.5 miles above the island. This battery, known as Battery No. 1 or the Redden Battery, commanded the approach to the bend. Vessels coming down the river would have to move directly toward its guns for more than a mile. It was not very effective, as it was sited on low ground, subject to flooding. Almost as soon as work was started, however, the attention of Maj. Gen. Leonidas Polk was diverted to the capture and fortification of Columbus. Work continued at Island No. 10, but it was not regarded as urgent and so was denied both equipment and workers. The importance of the New Madrid Bend rose dramatically when Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson fell to Union forces in early February 1862. Columbus was cut off from rest of the Confederate Army, and faced capture by Union troops advancing overland from the Tennessee River to the Mississippi. To avoid losing the garrison and its equipment, General Beauregard ordered that the position be abandoned as quietly as possible. The process began on February 24 when the first members of the Columbus garrison arrived at Island No. 10. 2 days later, its new commander, Brig. Gen. John P. McCown, arrived, and immediately set to work to strengthen the position from Battery No. 1 to Point Pleasant. McCown, with adequate resources, was able to transform the island and nearby mainland into a formidable obstacle for any fleet attempting to pass. By the middle of March, 5 batteries containing 24 guns had been built on the shore above the island, 19 guns were in 5 batteries on the island itself, and the floating Battery New Orleans, with 9 guns, was moored at the west end of the island. In addition, 2 forts had been set up at New Madrid, Fort Thompson to the west, with 14 guns, and Fort Bankhead with 7 guns to the east, where St. John's Bayou met the Mississippi. The Confederate Navy also supported the position. Flag Officer George N. Hollins commanded 6 gunboats in the river between Fort Pillow and Island No. 10. All of these were unarmored. The armored ram CSS Manassas would have been there also, but she was found to be unable to operate in the relatively shallow water. She was damaged by running aground on the way north, so she was sent back to New Orleans. Union preliminaries. Preparations by the Union for the attack on New Madrid and vicinity began before the evacuation of Columbus. On February 23, 1862, Maj. Gen. Pope was placed in command of the Army of the Mississippi, assembling at Commerce, Missouri. It was common practice at that time to go into winter quarters and await the arrival of good weather in the spring, but Pope soon had his army, which at this early stage of the campaign numbered 10,000 men, on the march, corduroying roads when necessary. The army arrived at New Madrid on March 3, but were not yet prepared to attack the Confederate positions. Preparing for a siege, Pope requested that his army be supplied with some heavy artillery, which arrived on March 12. The gunboats under Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote were not ready to cooperate with the Army of the Mississippi at this early date. As the damages they had received at Fort Donelson were still being repaired, they were finally sent down from Cairo on March 14, with Foote yet believing that they were not ready for combat. The Union fleet was augmented by the addition of 14 mortar rafts, vessels that each mounted a single 13-in mortar. The mortars were a semi-autonomous unit under the command of Captain Henry E. Maynard.